Gamal Abdel Nasser, dictator of Egypt, has nationalized the Suez Canal. Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister, sees this as an equivalent to Hitler marching into the Rhineland in 1936. And unlike the people of that time, Anthony Eden is going to respond. So he sets up a secret deal with the French and the Israelis. The Israelis are going to invade Suez. After all, Egypt is one of its enemies. And it's going to actually invade the Sinai. So Egypt is going to come westward from the Sinai and go as far as the eastern shore of the Suez Canal. In order to prevent another Arab-Israeli war from coming from this, the British and French are going to land forces, paratroopers and amphibious troops, all along the canal and occupy it and administer it. So the Israelis will hold Sinai to the east of the canal, and the Egyptians will hold the western shore. And really what's going on is that Britain and France are reversing Nasser's nationalization of the canal. The problem is, Anthony Eden does not inform President Eisenhower. And Anthony Eden is going to launch this attack within a week of an American presidential election. The 1956 presidential election between Dwight Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson, Republican versus Democrat, is about to happen. And suddenly, Eisenhower is blindsided by British and French troops parachuting into the Suez Canal, driving the Egyptos out, as the Israelis are driving in from the east. And it's clearly a setup. Moreover, this is the same time that the Soviets have invaded Hungary during the Hungarian uprising, also of 1956. So the West has been on a moral high horse about not invading countries that do things that annoy you. And suddenly, the British and French and the Israelis have conspired to get Egypt out of the Suez Canal. And for good reason, but they didn't inform Eisenhower. And Eisenhower, the man who led the Western attack against Hitler, a man who the Soviets genuinely respect, Eisenhower is furious. And Eisenhower publicly lets it be known that if the British and French don't immediately withdraw their forces from the Suez Canal, and Israel doesn't withdraw from Sinai, the United States will withdraw economic support for Britain, France, and Israel. This at a time when the United States economy is supporting the economies of Britain, France, and Israel. It's the equivalent of a public spanking. It's humiliating. The British and French pull out. The Israelis pull out. The only people who benefit from this, other than Nasser, are the Israelis, who at least demonstrate that they are militarily competent enough to take out Egyptian army forces pretty much anytime they want. So their stock rises in the Middle Eastern conflicts. But Britain and France look like they get spanked by Big Daddy America, which they had. Does Nasser thank the United States? Does he appreciate the United States? Does Nasser realign himself with the United States? Of course not. He deepens his ties with the Soviet Union. Arab nationalism seems to have stared down Britain, France, Israel, and made the United States quake in its boots so much that the U.S. gave the Arabs what they want. Nasser claims a propaganda victory. Well, what Britain learns from this, what the French learn from this too, although they don't like it, is that the age of their empires is past. When their ally, the United States, can literally yank the rug out from under their entire national economies as pressure to do or not do certain things, then it's simply going to be a set of humiliations. The truth is, the American State Department and American administrations from Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and Dwight Eisenhower are not particularly friendly to the European empires. The United States policies actually discourage the maintenance of empire. The U.S. allowed France to go back into Indochina and then left them to wither on the vine at Dien Bien Phu. The Americans did not want the British to fight back when in Kenya there was an uprising of people called Mau Mau who invented the flaming necktie, which is you take a black African that works with the British and you wrap a tire around their head, a vehicle tire, you douse it in gasoline, and you light it up. The Mau Mau were a terror group. They murdered blacks and whites, and the British responded, but the Americans made it clear, don't get too forceful. Don't use too much force. And now at Suez, they publicly spank. So the British conclude, that's it. We're done. We tried to civilize the world. We're done. 2 world wars and an ally that is undermining our empire are enough to say we're done. The United States is key in the destruction of Europe's empires, in the destruction of its allies' empires. And we get no credit for it from the third world. None. But we are. And Suez is a melodramatic example of that. So in 1960, Anthony Eden's replacement, Harold Macmillan, goes on a world tour. And in Cape Town, South Africa, at the airport there, he makes a speech. He says the winds of change are sweeping across Africa, and predicts that Britain will not fight these winds, but will work with them for early independence with black majority rule in all of its African colonies. Black majority rule is the key, because the elites that had ruled the white settlers that had come in as colonial administrators, farmers and soldiers in places like Kenya, Ghana, Northern and Southern Rhodesia, and South Africa, frankly, were not going to be left in charge of the colonies. Instead, it's going to be one man, one vote, with African populations that are culturally 2 generations away from pre-contact tribalism. But the British are not going to be seen as racists. No. The world has changed. And as a result, black majority rule, or native majority rule, as in the case of other places like Burma, is going to be the rule of the day. So this is going to provoke all sorts of problems. In Britain, the Nationality Act ends up turning industrial cities like Wolverhampton into enclaves that are like Little Delhi or Little Karachi or Little Kingstown or Little Nairobi or Mombasa. You have these ethnic ghettos, these enclaves where British custom and British law don't necessarily function, changing the character of neighborhoods and changing the crime rate and changing how dangerous it is to walk the streets and all the other things that Britons had taken for granted. And there's a strong racial component to this too, because these people who had not yet adapted and acclimated themselves to British norms were largely non-European, non-Caucasian. In 1968, one of Britain's bad boy politicians, a conservative named Enoch Powell, is going to make a speech to his constituents in Wolverhampton about this. He says, I look into the future and I see the Tiber as red with blood, which is a reference to Rome and the Sibyl and prophecies. And what he's talking about is Britain receiving over 1 million immigrants every year at that time who do not know British ways, do not understand British customs, do not abide by British norms. And how is this going to end well? He questions the unrestricted immigration policies of the British, started by the British Nationality Act of 1948, saying that it's destroying British cities and neighborhoods and British society, or at least it's damaging British society. That this idealistic, thoroughgoing pro-immigrant stance without any thought for the effect that dumping millions of unassimilated people per decade into your society, a society that only has 50 to 60 million people anyway, is going to do. However, the media picks up on this and calls Powell's speech the rivers of blood speech. And they imply that he's calling people to race war between whites and blacks. No, he wasn't. He was actually warning that if you continue to dump massive numbers of unassimilated immigrants into your society, you are inviting race war, a culture war, a war between what had been British and what is now British but really is still Kenyan or Zimbabwean or Indian or Pakistani or Jamaican or whatever. Closing your mind and calling anyone who criticizes unrestricted immigration a racist is not an answer to the problems that dumping large numbers of unassimilated people into your society always bring. But that's what happened. So, Britain is changing because of the Nationality Act. The world is changing as Britain pulls away from its colonies, and let's look closely at that next time.